Alright, welcome to part 2 of our PCG City. Now the graph is almost exactly how we left it in our last video, but the city assets have been replaced with simple example meshes. Overall, I would always recommend you start with simple meshes when working to lower the amount of unexpected variables or issues that can arise when using more complex meshes or assets. Alright, let's open the graph and continue where we left off. First, we need to grab both the starting points and the B street points. From here, add a difference node and subtract any starting points on the streets. Add a select points node to control the amount of buildings. Then add a difference node to control how far from the streets the building should be allowed to appear from. Set the density. Use an attribute filter and set the target attribute to density. And the operator to less than. Next, add two branch nodes. We won't use them yet, but it's for future use. From the A output, we're going to add a difference node. Again, not using it yet, but for the future. What we are going to use though is the set density loop graph we had in the last video. Copy and paste that over. Now get the point count from the difference node and connect that into the number of points. Now add an attribute noise and assort points. And we're going to use density for both. Now before we go any further, we need to look at the most important part of the graph. And that's where all the settings and adjustments for our buildings will actually take place, the data asset. This data asset is what holds the parameters for each building and the meshes each building type will use. That data asset is going to be a child of the primary data asset that I have over here. And here you can see all the normal variables like integers, floats, booleans, and also a custom data structure called PCG building meshes. Open that up and now you can see all the settings each individual mesh can have. The mesh itself, weight, is broken when auto scaling, is open back spacing, scale, is absolute, offset, pivot adjustment, has attachments, attachments location, growth, decal spawning, and the decal spawning material ID. Now that's a lot to take in, so pause the video if you need to get everything down. Note you don't absolutely need everything here. For example, open back only matters if you need interiors from the open back walls. And you can also create your own strut with only the variables you need. And that also applies to the primary data asset. I really wanted a lot of mesh variety, so I added a whole bunch of wall types. Although this project is just using the same mesh in different places. Now onto the city blueprint. We need to create a variable that will hold all our data assets. Call it building data array. and make it the city building primary data asset type. Make it an array, and now you can add as many different building types as you want. Just duplicate the data asset, replace the meshes, and change the settings. Now back to the graph, we're going to add our building sample graph. Now don't be afraid of all the graphs I have here, most of them are just extras and experimental. You don't actually have that many graphs in use. Now at this point I'm going to speed up and not make everything from scratch since we have a lot of ground to cover and I want to keep the video under an hour. First, create a building sampler loop graph. This is the graph that will take the building data array and apply it to each starting point to create the first floor of each building. It will take the starting points as the loop input, LW select like the streets to switch between horizontal and vertical, a difference input, an input for the data array, and a landscape yes or no input. For the moment, we're going to leave the landscape as 0. For the difference, use the base street points to exclude any building points that land on the street, and leave LW select as 0. Now into the graph itself. Let's start with this section right here. This is where the data asset is selected from the array. First, we get the entries count. We need to subtract 1 to correctly match the count with the index. Since the count would get us 1 and 2, but the index we need to choose from is 0 and 1. I then use the density of each point to select any number between 0 and the highest index. We round and then feed that into a clamp. I actually think this clamp might not be necessary, but I'll leave it alone for now though. Either way, we now use the resulting number to filter the index we need, and then get the properties we need from it. Get the first floor walls, which we use to create the first floor. The property you see above is for snapping with the terrain. We don't have it yet, so it won't be doing much. For now, match and set attributes and get the mesh attribute from this point. We use a point from mesh to get the bounds and set the size of the building units. Use the break vector attribute nodes and subtract the x from the bounds max with the bounds min. Absolute it. Now that's it for that segment. Actually, I don't know why I haven't labeled these yet. I'll probably add more of these to make sure everything's more understandable. Now this next part at least is very easy. It's literally just a copy and paste from the street graph, but replace the street length and width with the building length and width. The math above is just using the length of the wall to set the grid that will make the first floor. Make it the x and y of a new vector, and then again but divided by 4 and a z of 50. Use the numbers we just got to create a point grid of our first floor and then adjust the bounds of those points. And I also need to make these ridiculously long points into reroute nodes so they don't stretch halfway across the world. Seemed like an obvious thing to do in hindsight. Now we use a copy point to move the grid of points we created into the location of the starting point, and a difference node cut away from the street. Note that we don't use binary for this one, because I want the buildings to still touch the street, just not overlap it. And I'm going to skip the landscape portion for now, because the landscape as a whole deserves its own section and the complexity that arises from that. Once that's done, use an add attribute to save the building data, asset index used. For now, let's just end the graph by setting the density of the starting points into the new building points. And save the loop index as the building number. And of course, we also have the feedback loop that we used in the streets to switch between length and width. Now back in the main graph, merge the points and self-prune by density. Now before moving on, check that everything is working. And yep, I accidentally used the base grid points instead of the base street points at the beginning. You also want more points. This lonely one we're getting at the moment isn't enough, so increase the ratio in the select points. Now I'm going through and debugging each node to make sure we're all good. It looks like not quite. Looks like what I missed is the length of the street points. What we needed from the street is long lines, not these single points. So we need to use a bonds modifier to stretch them along the y by 2. Alright, now we're ready to move on. Sort points by density, and we're going to sort them out by descending. And partition also by density. Following that, we're also going to get a new subgraph called Building Proxy. It's not actually required for the final result, but I highly recommend it as a way to save on iteration time. Create 2 point inputs, one of which will be our loop, then add 4 attribute inputs. One will be the data asset array, and the other 3 will be called height curve 1, 2, and 3. Once you get the points and data asset plugged in, create 3 attribute properties. The first will have a value of 1, the second will have 50, and the third will have 0. Alright, now let's get into the graph and explain how it works. This section here is where we get the first floor mesh, like in the building sampler, only instead this time we're going to get the Z for the height instead of the Y and X. We start by getting the building index and filtering the data asset array. And from here it is the same as before. Get the mesh, mesh the point, get the bounce max and min, break the vector, get the z's, and subtract from each other, finally getting the absolute. Over here I did something to make the city a little more interesting. Completely optional, but I like having the extra effect it has. First, start with the data count and divide it by the loop index. Use that to divide by 1, and multiply by the first height curve. Then that gets multiplied by the density, and use that to subtract from the density, and that goes into the input B of the select node. Then input A will be density minus the height curve 2, divided by the loop index. And finally, the height curve 3 will be the switch that goes into the select node. Seems a bit convoluted? Yes, but I'll show you the effect later. Now what we want to do is take the resulting number and multiply it with the max floors. Round it and then clamp it with the min and max floors. This is the amount of floors the building will have, and that result will be multiplied with the wall height and divided by 100. We make that a vector and clamp min 1. This then becomes the scale we plug into transform point node that will scale up a default cube. With that, we should now have our Proxy City in the viewport. Now it's time to show what the height curve actually does. The first one is the most important one, which has the most effect. And the other two act more like adjustments to the first, so their effects are a little hard to see if the first one is too extreme. Overall, I found the settings of 150 and 0 to be a good default. Now time we get into the main building graph. As you'll notice, it has all the same settings as the proxy graph, plus a few more. So let's add those on. First the street points, then the street width, and we're going to leave the interiors off. The other three inputs are for manually adding and removing from the buildings, so we won't use that yet, so leave them empty. Now about the interiors, we won't use them yet. They work, but the performance cost and generation time simply isn't worth it yet. Now let's begin. First, we need to do a little bit of setup and get all our parameters. Filter out the data asset assigned to the building and get all the parameters in the data asset. Now we go through and start getting the wall size, thickness, and height the same way as before. But this time we'll need to add the roof walls to do that as well. Next, divide the wall size by 2 and make positive and negative x and y vectors. After that, we need the wall pivot. Take the wall size, divide it by 2, and multiply it by -1. Next, we need to make sure our corners are correctly placed with the wall corner spacing vector. Divide the wall thickness by 4 and add the wall corner spacing from the data asset. Above that, we have the building height. Same as the proxy graph, so I won't be going over it again. The only difference is that you don't need to divide it by 100 for this cube scale. Under that, we also have the final floor, but we still need some more work for that. Above that, we also have a min cutoff to make sure any building smaller than your settings doesn't go through. Alright, now moving on as we set the density to 1, make a reroute node and call it starting points 2, and add an extend modifier. Now let me turn off the meshes so you can see what we do with the points. With the set node, you can see the first floor points, and then after that, you can see the extent modifier turns those points into a flat representation of the first floor. Now onwards, we take the starting points and do what we did with the streets to get the perimeter with the x and y vectors. Make sure to rotate them properly for everything to work. Up next, we intersect the walls to get the corners. And also move the walls with the wall pivot to center the walls. Up next, we need to move those wall points up for each floor. For that to work properly, we need to create a floor loop. For that, create a spline with the building height. I know it seems a bit redundant to create this when we already have the building height, but we need an individual point and data entry for each floor. Now with that done, we can create the final floor, aka the roof. And now let's take a look at the copy points up subgraph. Moving the points up itself is nothing special, simply move the points up by the wall height each floor loop. The purpose of the rest of the graph is to split the floors between regular walls and a secondary wall set. With that done, use difference nodes to cut away from the first floor and cut out any doors. Now for the doors themselves. What I wanted to do here is only spawn a door if the section faces the street, since that is where a door would realistically be put. We do that with an intersection node, and just in case the street is too far away to register one, a random section of the building will be selected instead. Finally, we take a random choice node and use our door quantity setting. Now you can see the doors chosen. And we also have a manual cut here, but we're not using that, so there's nothing to see. More importantly, we need to move on to the auto scaling graph. What it does is divide the main walls with the incoming object and set that as the scale. Of course, there are some cases where you don't want this, or the mesh simply doesn't work with the auto scaling, in which case, use the broken when auto scaling setting. After that, we adjust the bounds to correctly match with the mesh. In that transform node I have afterwards, I think is just a leftover and not doing anything. What follows afterwards is any last adjustments to the mesh that you can specify in the data asset. That's the mesh's offset, pivot adjustment, scale, and is absolute. Now to finish up the walls, at the moment we have our walls split into three categories: the first floor walls, the regular walls, and secondary walls. Once you assign those by matching and setting attributes, partition by mesh, and add the auto scale subgraph. Since we've already seen that, move on to the open back subgraph. All it does is create a copy of the mesh facing inwards with some spacing. No wall removal is happening yet, so we'll move on to the wall attachments. Really simple stuff this time, just the loop graph checking if the wall has attachments, and then using the attachment location. After that, do the per mesh transform graph to add any last per mesh adjustments. Let's do the objects along the wall. Grab the first floor walls and move them out by the wall thickness. The only difference that matters here is the one that cuts away from the door. And from here we can merge the points and feed them into the subgraph that assigns the meshes from the data asset. From there we follow the set and match recipe. Scale the bounds, add a per mesh transform node. Although this one will be a little different though, it's a version 2. Instead of just setting one value, this one will let you set a range of min and max values for some randomness in the transform node. From there, we need to make sure that the meshes are not overlapping each time we spawn a different one with a difference node. That feedback being what feeds back into the difference node. What follows after that is just a select points node to control the quantity spawn before feeding into both the main out and a feedback. Alright, now onto the floor and ceiling. I'm going to disable the walls so we can see them better. You won't see the in-between floors because we have interiors disabled as well. So we'll just focus on the top floor. Now we've already seen most of what we need in this one before. And just like before, match and set attributes, partition by mesh, and a scale to size subgraph. Now we only use the floor ceiling thickness instead of the wall height. Again, we're going to ignore the stair cut since we don't have interiors yet. And we're also going to have a variation of the open back wall graph. Only this time it's going to be up and down instead of back and forth. And then since the ceiling and the floor usually look different, we have its own match and set attributes for this one as well. With that done, we can now add the rooftop add-ons. Take the final floor points and match and set the attributes from the rooftop add-ons in the data asset. Partition by mesh and auto scale just the bounds. We don't want to auto scale the meshes for these. Now if we debug, we don't see much because we're just using the example cube, but I'll address that in a bit. Before that, use roof to building size ratio to divide the roof point count. Feed that into a random choice and partition by index. Up next, what we have is a snap to rotation subgraph. Give it two inputs, snap degrees and snap segments. Add a density noise to get a random value between 0 and 1. Get that density and multiply it by the snap segments. Round and then multiply by the snap degrees. Make that a rotator and add it to the transform points rotation. Now I definitely need to change the preview mesh for this one or we won't see any of that rotation. With that done, partition by mesh and add a per mesh transform. Now let's get the rooftop. Something besides just a cube. An air duct will probably fit well. And maybe the second should be this antenna group. Now the corners, I believe, were without a doubt the most irritating part to figure out. And it has to do with the way the formed corners are located and rotated when convex versus concave. First, you need to separate them by pushing them forward in their respective direction. Then intersecting them with the first floor. Once you have that baked into the density, you can reverse the transform and filter out the convex from the concave corners. Once you have them separated, give them the proper transform that they each need before we finally get to match and set attribute the first floor and copy the points upward for the other floors. Now to explain the transform that we need to properly set the corners. We start with the walled corner spacing y and divide it by 2, add the walled corner spacing vector. That will move the exterior corners into place. Now the interior usually needs some additional adjustments, but I plan to compact that into the data asset to simplify. So what you mainly need is the inner corner adjust for the building corners and the roof corners. Put that into the X and negative that for the Y. I should also probably label which one is the inner corner to prevent confusion. How odd. This comment is acting a bit weirdly, rather annoying, but okay. Anyway, copy out the subgraph to move the points up the floor, and the roof corners only need the final floor. We then partition by mesh and auto-scale the corners with the thickness. Add a per mesh transform for any last adjustments, and then spawn mesh. The bonds modifier I think is in the leftovers, so I don't need that. And we almost forgot about the roof walls. Nothing new here, just take the wall points and move them up to the final floor. Match and set attributes, partition, auto scale using the roof thickness and height. Then check for open back and per mesh transform. And finally that finishes the exterior of our procedural buildings. Again, I won't be covering the interiors yet because they definitely need a massive overhaul. But if you're interested, they will still be included in the uploaded project files. And you can also check out the procedural building videos made by Procedural Mind, which were a major inspiration for this graph. Anyways, this video is already hitting the 1 hour mark, so we're going to finish it up. In the next video, we'll cover how to adopt the city to the landscape and also how to start adding manual additions to the city with other graphs or blueprints. Because procedural is at its best when it's combined with handcrafting and not just on its own. Remember, if you feel like supporting me, you can get the project files on Gumroad or on Patreon. Till next time.